"You're fired," the CEO told the janitor. The words fell like glass in a room that suddenly felt too small, too bright. David Costa stood with his mop, 65 years compressed into calloused hands and patient eyes, and looked at the young man who held his termination like a weapon. Marcus didn't see a father. He saw inefficiency. He saw the past that needed erasing. But David saw everything. 30 years of watching, of proximity without touch, of love hidden in the rhythm of cleaning schedules and overnight shifts. The adoption papers folded in his locker were a prayer he'd never dared speak aloud. Subscribed to witness the moment a son discovers the father he destroyed. David Costa moved through the law firm's 40th floor with the precision of a man who had memorized every corner, every shadow, every unnoticed space where silence pooled like water. His mop glided across marble that cost more than his yearly salary, and he did not resent the stone. He had long ago made peace with the language of labor, with the fact that his existence in this glass tower was conditional, peripheral, a necessary function that wealth required but refused to see. The city spread below him through floor-to-ceiling windows, San Francisco's lights a constellation of ambition and appetite, and he felt no connection to that glittering hunger. His world was smaller. His world was the 17 square feet around a supply closet on the 42nd floor, the break room on 39 where he ate lunch alone, and the corner office where Marcus Webb, 35 years old, ruthless, brilliant, now sat as CEO. David had watched that office for 3 decades, first as a paralegal's workspace, then as a senior partner's domain. And now, as the throne of a young man whose face carried echoes, David recognized in his own mirror. The building exhaled at night. After the lawyers departed with their leather briefcases and their aura of controlled violence, after the assistants shut down computers and the security guards settled into their routines, the firm became David's cathedral. He swept conference rooms where decisions were made that altered lives, where contracts were signed that moved millions, where words were deployed like surgical instruments. He emptied trash bins filled with crumpled drafts of arguments, discarded coffee cups still warm, the debris of intellect and strategy. He did this work with a meticulousness that no one noticed, because excellence in invisibility is its own erasure. But he noticed everything. He noticed which lawyers stayed late, which ones drank too much, which ones wept in bathroom stalls. He noticed Marcus Webb's patterns most of all, the young CEO's habit of working past midnight, his refusal to eat lunch, the way his shoulders carried tension like a monument to self-discipline. David noticed because watching Marcus was the only intimacy he had allowed himself for 35 years. The adoption had been clean, clinical, a transaction completed when David was 30 and broken in ways he couldn't articulate. The mother had left during pregnancy, vanished into an America vast enough to swallow anyone who wanted disappearing. David had held the infant for 47 seconds in a hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and endings, and in those seconds he had made a calculation that would define the rest of his life. He could not provide. He had no family, no resources, no capacity to transform himself into the stability a child required. But he could choose the parents, a corporate lawyer and his wife, educated, wealthy, desperate for a son. He could ensure the boy would have everything David couldn't give, and he could take a job, any job, that would keep him in proximity without revelation. The law firm had been hiring maintenance staff. David applied. He was hired. He became a ghost in the machine of Marcus's ascent. 30 years of proximity had taught David the topography of his son's life in fragments and inferences. He knew Marcus's coffee order because he restocked the kitchen. He knew Marcus's temperament because he observed which assistants quit, which ones lasted. He knew Marcus's ambition because he watched the young man devour the firm from within, rising from associate to partner to CEO with a velocity that left colleagues stunned or resentful. David never spoke to Marcus directly. Their worlds operated on different frequencies, separated by class and function, and the unbreachable divide between those who command and those who clean. But David spoke to Marcus in other ways, through the perfectly maintained restroom on the executive floor, through the conference room that was always immaculate before morning meetings, through the small adjustments of care that Marcus would never register as care. This was David's language. This was his fatherhood. Tonight, the building felt different. David sensed it in the air's density, in the way fluorescent lights hummed with a frequency slightly off. He was pushing his cart past the executive suite when he saw Marcus through the glass wall of the corner office, seated at his desk, face illuminated by the cold glow of a laptop screen. It was past 11. The young CEO's tie was loosened, his jaw tight with the exhaustion of someone who had not yet learned that ambition is a fire that consumes its own fuel. David paused, his hand on the cart's handle, and allowed himself a moment of observation. He saw his own bone structure in Marcus's face, the same angular cheekbones, the same intensity in the eyes. He saw the mother's mouth, though, the full lips that suggested a softness Marcus had disciplined out of himself. David's chest tightened with a feeling he had trained himself not to name, a sensation somewhere between pride and grief, and he moved on before Marcus could glance up and register his presence. The intercom crackled to life as David entered the break room on the 41st floor. Marcus's voice, sharp and impatient, requesting David report to his office. It was unusual. In 3 decades, Marcus had never summoned him, never acknowledged him as anything more than part of the building's infrastructure. David set down his mop, smoothed his uniform, a grey jumpsuit that smelled faintly of bleach and resignation, and took the elevator up 1 floor. His heart, which had survived 65 years of labor and solitude, began to beat with an unfamiliar urgency. He did not know what awaited him. He did not know that the architecture of silence he had constructed was about to collapse. He only knew, as the elevator doors opened and he walked toward Marcus's office, that proximity was about to transform into collision, and that some distances once crossed cannot be uncrossed. Marcus Webb did not look up when David entered the office. The older man stood in the doorway, his body occupying space with the apologetic posture of someone accustomed to being interruption rather than presence. Marcus's office was a study in controlled aesthetics, minimalist furniture, a glass desk free of clutter, walls decorated with framed accolades and photographs of Marcus shaking hands with politicians and corporate titans. The room smelled of expensive cologne and ambition, a scent that David had learned to associate with his son from years of cleaning this space after hours. Now, standing here while Marcus was present, David felt the dissonance of occupying the same temporal frame, the same moment, rather than existing in the aftermath of Marcus's day. It was disorienting, like seeing a painting subject step out of the canvas. Marcus finally glanced up, his expression flat, professional, the look of a man about to execute a necessary but tedious task. "Mr. Costa," Marcus began, and David noted the formality, the distance embedded in the address. "I've been reviewing staffing costs and operational efficiency. This firm has always prided itself on lean management, on eliminating redundancies." He spoke as if reading from a script he'd rehearsed, his voice devoid of warmth or hesitation. David stood very still, his hands clasped in front of him, his face neutral. He had witnessed versions of this speech before, delivered to paralegals and junior associates who failed to meet Marcus's exacting standards. He had never imagined he would be on the receiving end, but he was not surprised. He had always known his invisibility was conditional, that the moment his labor was deemed insufficient, he would be erased. Marcus continued, his eyes fixed on a document in front of him rather than on David's face. Your performance metrics have declined. You're slower than the other maintenance staff. There have been complaints about bathrooms not being cleaned thoroughly, trash not being emptied on schedule. David listened to the accusations without protest. He knew they were pretexts, flimsy justifications for a decision already made. The truth was simpler. Marcus was consolidating power, cutting costs, demonstrating to the board that he was willing to make hard choices. David was 65, his joints stiff from decades of repetitive motion, his pace no longer what it once was. But he had never been careless. He had never left a task incomplete. The complaints Marcus referenced were likely fabrications or isolated incidents exaggerated into patterns. David understood that in institutions like this, narrative mattered more than fact. If Marcus declared him inadequate, then inadequate he became. The young CEO finally looked up, his gaze meeting David's for the first time, and in that moment David saw no recognition, no curiosity, only the cold efficiency of a man trained to view people as assets or liabilities. "I'm letting you go, Mr. Costa," Marcus said, his tone final. "Effective immediately. HR will process your severance. You can collect your belongings tonight." The words hung in the air between them, and David felt the ground shift beneath him in a way that had nothing to do with physical balance. He had prepared for this possibility, had imagined it countless times over the years, but the reality was sharper, more brutal than fantasy. This was not just termination. This was the severing of the only connection he had maintained to the son he had given away. For 30 years, this job had been his justification, his reason to wake at 4 in the morning and ride 3 buses across the city. It had been his way of remaining in Marcus's life without disrupting it, his method of fatherhood that required nothing from Marcus in return. And now Marcus, unknowing, was casting him out. David's mind raced through options. Through the decision tree he had constructed long ago for this scenario. He could leave quietly, disappear as he had always intended to, take his severance and find work elsewhere, maintain the silence that had defined his relationship to Marcus. Or he could speak. He could crack open the truth and let it spill into this sterile office with its view of the city's indifferent lights. "You can't fire your own father, son," David said, and the words emerged with a calm that surprised him, a steadiness that belied the terror coursing through his veins. He had not planned to say it. The sentence had formed itself, rising from some deep place where 30 years of restraint had accumulated into a pressure that could no longer be contained. Marcus froze. His hand, which had been reaching for a pen, stopped in mid-air. His eyes, which had been scanning the termination document, snapped up to David's face with a sudden, violent focus. The silence that followed was not the comfortable silence of an empty building, but the charged silence of air before lightning strikes. David watched his son's face cycle through expressions: confusion, irritation, disbelief, each emotion flickering across his features like frames in a film reel. Marcus's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice low, dangerous, the tone of a man who suspects he is being mocked but isn't certain. David held his gaze. He had crossed the threshold now, had stepped out of the role he had inhabited for 3 decades, and there was no returning to invisibility. "I said you can't fire your own father," he repeated, and this time he added weight to the words. Let them carry the full burden of their implication. "I'm your father, Marcus. I gave you up for adoption 35 years ago, when you were 3 days old. I took this job so I could stay close, so I could watch you grow, so I could be near you, even if you never knew who I was." The confessions spilled out in a rush now, the dam breaking, 30 years of silence flooding into speech. "I couldn't provide for you. I had nothing, but I made sure you went to a family that could give you everything, and I stayed." I stayed and I watched and I cleaned the floors you walked on and I emptied the trash from your office and I—" His voice cracked and he stopped himself, swallowing hard against the emotion that threatened to unmoor him completely. Marcus stood abruptly, his chair rolling back and hitting the wall with a dull thud. His face had gone pale, his hands braced against the desk as if he needed physical support to remain upright. "That's insane," he said, his voice rising. "You're lying. This is some kind of— I don't know what this is, but it's not real. It's not—" He was shaking his head, denial pouring out of him in waves. David reached into his pocket slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements that might escalate Marcus's agitation. He withdrew a folded piece of paper, worn soft from years of being carried, and placed it on the desk between them. "Adoption papers," David said quietly. "Your birth certificate. My name is on it, and there's a photo. You were 3 days old. I held you for less than a minute before they took you, but I held you." He pushed the paper toward Marcus, and the young CEO stared at it as if it were a live grenade, something that could detonate and obliterate everything he understood about himself. The office felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in, the air too thick to breathe properly. David waited. He had nothing left to do but wait and watch as his son confronted the truth that would shatter the architecture of his entire life. Marcus did not touch the paper. He stared at it from across the desk, his body rigid, his breathing shallow. David could see the conflict playing out behind his son's eyes, the lawyer's mind demanding evidence, cross-examination, proof beyond reasonable doubt, while some deeper, more primitive part of Marcus recoiled from the possibility that his origin story, the narrative he had built his identity upon, might be false. The adoption papers lay between them like a border between countries, a line that could not be crossed without consequence. Finally, with movements that suggested he was approaching something hazardous, Marcus reached for the document. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it, and David watched his son's eyes scan the typed text, the official stamps, the signatures that turned lives into legal transactions. David saw the moment recognition hit, a microscopic shift in Marcus's expression, a tightening around the eyes, a slight parting of the lips. The birth certificate listed David Matthew Costa as father, Marcus Anthony Costa as newborn, and a mother whose name had been redacted, lost to time and bureaucracy. "This could be forged," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was grasping for rationality, for a framework that would let him dismiss what he was seeing, but the evidence was confronting him with a solidity that resisted easy dismissal. David nodded slowly. "It could be," he agreed, "but it's not. There's a photo, too, in my locker. I can get it if you want." Marcus's jaw clenched. He set the paper down carefully, as if afraid it might crumble, and leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window, to the city beyond. David could see his son's mind working, processing, trying to integrate this new information into the existing structure of his life. Marcus had been raised by Thomas and Eleanor Webb, prominent figures in San Francisco's legal community. He had grown up in a Pacific Heights mansion, attended private schools, been groomed for success from infancy. His parents, his adoptive parents, had never hidden the fact of his adoption, but they had been vague about the details, had told him only that his biological parents were young, unable to care for him, and had made the loving choice to give him a better life. Marcus had never pressed for more information. He had never felt the need. The Webbs were his parents in every way that mattered. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Marcus asked, his voice hollow. He was still looking out the window, unable or unwilling to meet David's eyes. The question hung in the air, weighted with betrayal, with the accumulated years of deception. David had known this question would come, had rehearsed answers in his mind during sleepless nights, but now that it was being asked, the rehearsed words felt inadequate. Because you didn't need me, David said simply. You had parents who loved you, who gave you everything. What was I supposed to do? Show up and disrupt your life? Tell you that your real father was a janitor with no education, no prospects, nothing to offer you except confusion? He paused, choosing his words carefully. I stayed because I needed to know you were okay. I needed to see you grow up, even from a distance. It was selfish, maybe, but it was the only way I could be your father without ruining what you had. Marcus turned back to face him, and David saw anger flaring in his son's eyes now, the shock giving way to fury. So you just watched? Marcus's voice was sharp, accusatory. What, you mopped floors and emptied trash and spied on me for 30 years? That's not being a father. That's being a stalker. That's being... He stopped himself, his hands clenched into fists on the desk. David absorbed the words without flinching. He had known Marcus would be angry. He had no right to expect gratitude or understanding. You're right, David said quietly. It's not traditional fatherhood, but it's what I could give. I made sure your office was clean. I made sure the building was safe. I watched you become the man I never could be. I watched you succeed, and that was enough for me. I didn't need you to know. I just needed to be close. The explanation sounded thin, even to his own ears, a justification that collapsed under scrutiny, but it was the truth. He had not stayed for recognition. He had stayed because proximity, even without acknowledgement, was better than absence. Marcus stood again, pacing now, his movements agitated, caged. He ran a hand through his hair, disrupting the careful styling, and David saw in that gesture a glimpse of the child Marcus had once been, unguarded, vulnerable, human beneath the layers of professional armor. I need proof, Marcus said finally, stopping in front of the window, his back to David. Real proof, not just papers, DNA test, something concrete. His voice was calmer now, but there was a brittleness to it, a control imposed by sheer will. David nodded, though Marcus couldn't see him. Of course, he said. I'll do whatever test you want. I'm not trying to claim anything from you, Marcus. I'm not asking for a relationship or money or... He trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. What was he asking for? He hadn't thought that far ahead. He had spoken the truth in a moment of desperation, a reflex to prevent his own erasure, but he hadn't considered what would come after the revelation. Get out, Marcus said, his voice flat. He still hadn't turned around. Take your things and leave. I'll have HR contact you about the DNA test. But until then, I don't want to see you in this building. The dismissal was cold, final, and David felt it like a physical blow. He had known this was a possible outcome, but knowing and experiencing were different animals. He nodded again, a habit of deference so ingrained it operated independently of conscious thought, and turned to leave. As he reached the door, Marcus spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. Why now? After 30 years, why tell me now? David paused, his hand on the doorframe. He considered lying, offering some noble reason, but he was done with deception. Because you were firing me, he said honestly, and I couldn't let you erase me without knowing who I was. It was selfish. I'm sorry. He left before Marcus could respond, walking down the corridor with legs that felt unsteady, past the conference rooms and the empty cubicles, into the elevator that would carry him down and out of the only proximity to his son he had ever known. The building was silent around him, and he realized that silence, which had once been his ally, was now unbearable. 3 days passed before David received the call from HR. 3 days during which he remained in his small apartment in the Tenderloin, a studio with peeling paint and a window that overlooked an alley where fog accumulated like unspoken regrets. He did not sleep well. He lay on his narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, replaying the confrontation in Marcus's office, analyzing every word, every expression, searching for clues about what would come next. He had no regrets about speaking the truth, but he mourned the loss of his job, the structure it had provided, the purpose. Without the law firm, his days felt shapeless, untethered. He tried to fill the hours with mundane tasks, cleaning his apartment, walking through the city, sitting in cafes with a cup of coffee he couldn't afford, but nothing held his attention. His mind kept circling back to Marcus, to the look of shock and fury on his son's face, to the question of whether the DNA test would confirm what David had always known, or whether some cosmic joke would reveal he had been wrong all along, that 30 years of proximity had been built on a mistake. The HR representative was professional, detached, a woman named Jennifer, who spoke in the practiced tones of someone delivering uncomfortable information with corporate efficiency. She explained the DNA testing process. A simple cheek swab, results in 5 business days, all costs covered by the firm. She did not mention Marcus by name, referred to him only as the concerned party, and David appreciated the discretion, even as it underscored how thoroughly he existed outside Marcus's world. They scheduled an appointment at a medical facility downtown, and David took 2 buses to get there, arriving 15 minutes early because punctuality was a habit. Decades of service work had embedded into his nervous system. The clinic was sterile, fluorescent, staffed by technicians who asked no questions and showed no curiosity. David opened his mouth, let them swab the inside of his cheek, signed forms that he didn't bother reading. The entire process took less than 10 minutes. Afterward, he stood on the sidewalk outside the clinic, feeling oddly hollow, as if the swab had removed more than cells, had extracted some essential part of his identity that could not be returned. 5 days later, the results arrived via email, which David accessed at a public library because he did not own a computer. The email was from Jennifer in HR, the subject line reading, "DNA analysis results." David's hand shook slightly as he clicked it open. The message was brief, clinical. "Dear Mr. Costa, the DNA analysis has been completed. The results indicate a 99.9% probability of biological paternity. A full report has been forwarded to the relevant parties. Please contact HR if you have questions regarding your employment status or benefits." That was all. No commentary, no acknowledgement of what this meant, just data processed and filed away. David read the sentence 3 times. 99.9% probability of biological paternity, letting the confirmation settle into his bones. He had known, of course. He had never doubted. But there was a difference between knowing and having it verified by science, by systems that did not traffic in emotion or memory, but only in the cold arithmetic of genetic markers. He did not hear from Marcus. Days turned into a week, then 2. David checked his email obsessively, hoping for some message, some indication of how Marcus had received the results, but there was nothing. He called the law firm once, asked to speak with Marcus, and was told politely but firmly that Mr. Webb was unavailable and would not be taking calls from David Costa. The rejection stung, though David had no right to be surprised. He had upended Marcus's life, had inserted chaos into the carefully ordered existence his son had constructed, and Marcus was dealing with it the way he dealt with all problems, by asserting control, by creating distance, by refusing to engage until he had processed the situation on his terms. David understood this intellectually, but understanding did nothing to alleviate the ache of being shut out, of having finally revealed himself only to be met with silence. He found work at a supermarket, stocking shelves during the overnight shift. The job paid less than the law firm, and the work was more physically demanding, but it was employment, and employment meant structure, meant a reason to move through the hours. His co-workers were younger, mostly immigrants from Central America and Southeast Asia, and they treated David with a mixture of respect and pity, recognizing him as someone who had fallen from a slightly higher rung of the economic ladder. He did not tell them about Marcus, about the son who was a CEO, about the revelation that had cost him everything. He existed in the supermarket's fluorescent night as he had existed in the law firm. Quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention. But the quality of his invisibility had changed. Before, it had been chosen, a strategic retreat into the margins. Now, it felt imposed, a punishment for having dared to step into the light. One evening, as David was leaving the supermarket at dawn, the sun just beginning to pale the eastern sky, he saw Marcus standing beside a black sedan parked across the street. His son was dressed casually, jeans and a sweater, and he looked thinner than David remembered, shadows under his eyes suggesting sleepless nights. Their eyes met across the distance, and for a moment neither moved, as if both were calculating the risk of approach. Then Marcus crossed the street, walking with a deliberateness that suggested he had rehearsed this encounter, had planned what he would say. David waited, his heart accelerating, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket to keep them from trembling. When Marcus reached him, he stopped an arm's length away, maintaining a buffer of space that felt both respectful and guarded. "We need to talk," Marcus said, and his voice was different from the last time David had heard it, softer, stripped of the corporate authority, more human. David nodded. "Okay," he said simply, and followed Marcus to the sedan, climbing into the passenger seat and letting himself be driven into a future he could not predict, but had spent 35 years moving toward. Marcus drove in silence, navigating the early morning streets with the focus of someone using the mechanics of driving to avoid conversation. David sat beside him, watching the city scroll past through the window. The closed storefronts, the homeless encampments under freeway overpasses, the joggers beginning their routes through neighborhoods where ambition was architecture and wealth was distance from suffering. He did not ask where they were going. He had spent decades deferring to others' decisions, and the habit persisted even now, even in this car with his son, even after truth had been spoken. Marcus pulled into a parking lot adjacent to Crissy Field. The beach and the bay, stretching out grey and restless under a sky still deciding whether to commit to daylight. They walked down to the sand without speaking, and David was grateful for the silence, for the chance to simply be near Marcus without the pressure of words. The beach was nearly empty at this hour, just a few early risers walking dogs, a lone figure doing Tai Chi near the water's edge. They found a bench facing the bay, and Marcus sat down heavily, as if the act of driving had exhausted him. David sat beside him, maintaining a respectful distance, his body angled slightly away to give Marcus space. The Golden Gate Bridge loomed to their left, its towers disappearing into fog that would burn off later, and David thought about how many times he had seen this view, how it had always felt like a promise of elsewhere, of possibility, a promise that had never quite materialized for him. Marcus finally spoke, his voice low, tentative. "I've been trying to understand why I'm so angry," he said, staring out at the water. "The DNA test came back. You're my biological father, that's a fact, but I keep circling back to this feeling of betrayal, I guess. Not because you gave me up, I understand that. My parents, Thomas and Eleanor, they told me about adoption when I was old enough to understand. They framed it as a gift, a sacrifice someone made so I could have a better life. I accepted that. I never felt the need to search for my biological parents." David listened without interrupting. This was Marcus's moment to speak, to articulate the chaos that David's revelation had unleashed. And David owed him the space to do so. Marcus continued, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "The betrayal isn't the adoption, it's the watching, the fact that you were there in my life for 30 years, and I never knew. You saw me grow up. You witnessed all of it, my struggles, my successes, the times I was cruel, the times I was weak, and you never said anything. You just observed, like I was some kind of experiment. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and David heard the wound beneath the anger, the existential violation of having been watched by a stranger who was not a stranger, of having lived one's life on a stage one didn't know existed. I keep thinking about all the times I passed you in the hallway, all the times I probably didn't even see you because you were just furniture, part of the building, and you were my father. My father. David absorbed the words, felt their weight. You're right, he said quietly. It was a violation. I knew that even while I was doing it, but I couldn't leave. I tried once, years ago, when you were about 10. I quit the firm, found a job across the city. I lasted 2 months before I came back. I told myself I needed the job, the pay, but that was a lie. I needed to see you. It was an addiction, maybe, or a kind of penance. I gave you away, and watching you was the only way I could convince myself that the decision was right, that you were thriving without me. He paused, searching for the right words. I know that doesn't justify it. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just trying to explain the logic, even though the logic was probably insane. Marcus turned to look at him for the first time since they'd sat down. His eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted. Why did you give me up? He asked. And David heard genuine curiosity beneath the question, not accusation. My parents said my biological parents were young, unable to provide, but you were 30 when I was born. That's not young. What happened? David had known this question would come, had prepared for it as much as one can prepare for excavating old wounds. But the answer still required effort, a deliberate unburying of history he had tried to seal away. Your mother left when she was 7 months pregnant, he said, his voice steady. She was 22. We weren't married. We were barely together, honestly. When she told me she was pregnant, I panicked. I had a job at a warehouse, minimum wage, no benefits. I was living in a studio barely bigger than a closet. She said she'd handle it, that she had plans. I didn't know what that meant. One day she was gone, David continued, staring at his hands, at the lines and scars that mapped his labor. She left a note saying she couldn't do it, that she was sorry, that she'd signed papers giving me full custody if I wanted it. The baby, you, would be born in 3 weeks. I had 3 weeks to figure out what to do. I tried, Marcus. I looked for better jobs, asked family for help. But I didn't have family. Not really. My parents died when I was young, and I'd bounced through foster care. I had no network, no resources. I knew I could technically keep you. The state would have helped, maybe. But I looked at my life, at what I could offer, and it was nothing. Poverty, instability, a father who was barely keeping himself afloat. He felt the old shame rising, the feeling of inadequacy that had never fully left him. So I contacted an adoption agency. They found Thomas and Eleanor. They were perfect. Wealthy, educated, desperate for a child. They promised to give you everything. And I thought, this is the loving choice. This is what a real father would do. Marcus was silent for a long moment, processing. Did you ever try to contact her? My biological mother? David shook his head. No. She made it clear she wanted out. I respected that. I never tried to find her. Another silence, this one heavier, suffused with all the alternative histories that could have been. Finally, Marcus spoke again. Thomas and Eleanor are good people. They loved me. They gave me everything you said they would. I can't be angry at them, and I can't regret the life I had, but I also can't pretend this doesn't change things. Knowing you were there, watching, it recontextualizes my entire life. Every success I had, every moment I thought was mine alone, you were witnessing it, and that feels, he struggled to find the word, Haunted. My life feels haunted now. David nodded slowly. I understand. And I'm sorry. I didn't consider how it would feel from your perspective. I only thought about what I needed, which was selfish. He hesitated, then added, If you want me to disappear, I will. I'll leave the city. You'll never have to see me again. I don't expect anything from you, Marcus. I don't expect a relationship or reconciliation or forgiveness. I wanted you to know who I was before I was gone. That's all. The offer hung in the air between them, a door Marcus could choose to open or close. And David waited, the sound of waves against sand filling the silence that stretched between them like a geography neither could map. Marcus did not answer immediately. He stood from the bench and walked toward the water's edge, his feet crunching against sand mixed with broken shells and fragments of kelp washed ashore by the tide. David remained seated, watching his son's silhouette against the grey morning light, the way Marcus's shoulders rose and fell with breathing that seemed effortful, deliberate, as if each inhalation required conscious decision. The fog was lifting now, revealing the bridge in sections, and David thought about revelation itself, how truth emerged slowly, piece by piece, never all at once. He had spent 35 years hiding in plain sight, constructing a life around a single organizing principle: proximity without contact, love without acknowledgement, fatherhood as surveillance. Now that the structure had collapsed, he found himself in unfamiliar territory, waiting for his son to decide what would replace the ruins. Marcus returned after several minutes, his shoes damp from the advancing tide. He sat down again, closer this time, the distance between them on the bench reduced to inches rather than feet. "I don't want you to leave," he said finally, his voice carrying a resignation that felt hard-earned, not impulsive. "I don't know what I want, honestly, but I know that you disappearing again, would just be another kind of abandonment, and I've been thinking about abandonment a lot these past 2 weeks." He paused, gathering his thoughts with the same methodical precision he probably applied to legal arguments. "Thomas and Eleanor never made me feel abandoned. They were present, attentive, loving in their way. But there was always this abstract knowledge that someone else had given me away. It was background noise, not something I actively thought about, but it was there. And now you're telling me that someone never actually left, that you were there the whole time, just invisible." David felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't fully recognized until it began to release. "I don't expect gratitude," he said carefully. "I know watching you doesn't qualify as parenting. Real parenting is sacrifice and presence, and I gave you neither. But I want you to understand that every day I stayed, it was a choice. I could have moved cities, started over, tried to forget, but I stayed. Maybe that's pathetic, maybe it's obsessive. But it was the only form of fidelity I was capable of." He looked at Marcus directly now, allowing himself the intimacy of sustained eye contact. "You became an incredible man, despite me, not because of me. But I got to witness it, and that's more than I deserved." The confession felt like shedding skin, exposing something raw underneath. And David was surprised by how much relief accompanied the vulnerability. Marcus absorbed this, his jaw working as if chewing on words before speaking them. "I fired you," he said, and the statement carried weight beyond the obvious. "I looked at you and saw inefficiency, saw dead weight that needed cutting. I didn't see a person with a history, with reasons for being slower, for being tired. I saw a problem to solve. And that's who I've become, someone who looks at people as assets or liabilities, who makes decisions based on metrics and profitability. Thomas trained me that way. He's brilliant, ruthless when he needs to be, and he raised me to see the world through that lens. But firing my own father—" He stopped, the irony too heavy to articulate fully. It's like the universe was holding up a mirror, showing me what I've turned into. David shook his head gently. You didn't know. You can't blame yourself for not recognizing someone you'd never been told to look for. But Marcus wasn't listening, was caught in his own spiral of revelation. That's the thing, though. Even if you hadn't been my father, you were still a 65-year-old man who'd worked at the firm for 3 decades. You deserved better than a termination notice delivered without empathy. But I didn't think about that. I didn't think about you as a human being with a life beyond your function in my building, and that's monstrous. That's not who I want to be. His voice was rising now, emotion breaking through the careful control. You stayed to watch me, and what you watched was me becoming the kind of person who would erase you without a second thought. What does that say about the life you gave me? What does that say about the choices you made? The question struck David with unexpected force. He had never considered his sacrifice from that angle. Had never asked himself whether the wealth and education and opportunity he'd secured for Marcus had produced a better man, or simply a more successful one. I don't know, David admitted, the honesty more painful than any lie would have been. I wanted you to have options I never had. I wanted you to be safe, secure, free from the kind of desperation that shaped my life. But maybe I didn't think about what success would cost you. Maybe I was so focused on material outcomes that I didn't consider who you'd become in the process of achieving them. He felt the weight of complicity, of having contributed to Marcus's formation even in absence. But Marcus, you're here. Right now, you're questioning yourself, examining your behavior, trying to be better. That counts for something. That suggests you're not the monster you think you are. Marcus looked at him then, really looked, and David saw his son's eyes were wet with tears that hadn't yet fallen. I want to know you, Marcus said, the words emerging like a confession, like an admission of need that violated everything he'd been trained to project. I don't know how. I don't know what a relationship between us would even look like, but I need to understand where I came from. Not the sanitized adoption story, but the real history. Your history, my mother's history, whatever you know of it, the circumstances that made me. Because right now, I feel like I'm floating untethered, like the foundation I thought I was standing on was never real. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. I need you to tell me who I am. David felt the enormity of the request. Marcus was asking him to be a father in a way he had never been allowed to be, to provide not material support, but narrative coherence, to build a bridge between the man Marcus had become and the child he had been. I can try, David said slowly. But you need to understand that I don't have all the answers. I can tell you about your mother, what little I knew of her. I can tell you about the day you were born, the 47 seconds I held you. I can tell you about the 30 years I spent watching you from the margins. But I can't tell you who you are. That's something you have to decide for yourself. He reached out tentatively, his hand hovering near Marcus's shoulder, asking permission without words. Marcus nodded almost imperceptibly, and David let his hand settle there, felt the warmth of his son's body through the sweater, felt the slight tremor that suggested Marcus was fighting to maintain composure. It was the first time David had touched his son since the hospital, and the contact felt both monumental and insufficient. They sat like that for a long time, David's hand on Marcus's shoulder, the bay spreading out before them with its cargo ships and sailboats, its currents that moved according to laws neither of them fully understood. Eventually, Marcus spoke again, his voice steadier. I want to do this right. I want to build something real between us, not based on guilt or obligation, but on actual connection. But I need time. I need to process all of this, figure out what it means, how to integrate it into my life. Can you give me that time? David nodded immediately. Take all the time you need. I've waited 35 years. I can wait longer. Marcus turned to look at him, a small smile flickering across his face. Fragile and genuine. "Thank you," he said simply, and David understood that the gratitude wasn't just for the patience, but for everything. For the sacrifice, for the revelation, for the willingness to be seen and judged and potentially rejected. They stood together and walked back toward the car, and though nothing was resolved, though the future remained uncertain and fraught with complexity, David felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades: hope. The weeks that followed were an exercise in careful construction. Marcus reached out via text messages that arrived at irregular intervals, sometimes daily, sometimes with days of silence between them, each message carrying the tentative quality of someone learning a new language. He asked questions about David's childhood, about the warehouse job, about the day Marcus was born and the hours leading up to the decision to pursue adoption. David answered as honestly as he could, neither embellishing nor withholding, trying to offer his history without expectation of sympathy or absolution. He told Marcus about growing up in foster care, about the succession of temporary homes that taught him to travel light emotionally, to not attach because attachment meant inevitable loss. He told Marcus about meeting his mother at a community college where both were taking night classes, about how their relationship had been more collision than romance, two lonely people orbiting each other briefly before gravity failed. Marcus absorbed these stories in pieces, processing them with the analytical mind that had made him successful in law. He would sometimes respond with follow-up questions that revealed he'd been researching, cross-referencing David's memories with public records and historical context, building a case file on his own origins. David found this approach both touching and sad. The way Marcus needed evidence and verification, even for something as intimate as family history. But he understood it was how his son made sense of chaos, by imposing structure and demanding proof. And David participated in the process without resistance. He provided documents when Marcus asked for them: old pay stubs, rental agreements, photographs from the era when disposable cameras were still common and memory was physical rather than digital. Each piece of evidence was another brick in the foundation they were trying to build. They met for coffee on a Saturday morning 6 weeks after the beach conversation, in a neutral cafe in the Mission District where neither of them had personal history. Marcus arrived exactly on time, dressed in casual clothes that still managed to signal expense and care, and David was already seated with 2 cups of black coffee he'd ordered preemptively, a gesture of hospitality that felt awkward even as he made it. They exchanged careful greetings, the formality of near strangers who were trying to become something else, and settled into a booth near the window. Marcus had brought a folder with him, and he opened it to reveal a timeline he'd constructed, a detailed chronology of David's life and his own, showing the points of intersection and divergence. "I made this," Marcus said, almost apologetically, sliding the document across the table. "It helps me visualize how we've existed in relation to each other. I know it's probably excessive, but—" "It's not excessive," David interrupted gently. "It's who you are. You need to organize information to understand it. There's nothing wrong with that." He studied the timeline, marveling at the precision, the way Marcus had noted major events in both their lives. David's hiring at the law firm, corresponding with Marcus's 10th birthday. David's brief resignation attempt coinciding with Marcus's high school graduation. The years of parallel existence rendered visible through careful documentation. "This is remarkable," David said honestly. "You've mapped something I experienced but never articulated. Seeing it like this, it makes it real in a different way." Marcus seemed relieved by David's response, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "I've been thinking about the nature of fatherhood," he said, his fingers tracing the timeline's margins. "What it means, what it requires. Thomas was my father in every functional sense. He taught me how to think, how to argue, how to navigate the world, but he also taught me to suppress emotion, to view relationships transactionally, to prioritize achievement over connection. David listened, sensing Marcus was working towards something important. Eleanor, my mother, my adoptive mother, she balanced Thomas somewhat. She was warmer, more emotionally available, but she also enabled his approach, never challenged the way he raised me to be ruthless. Marcus looked up from the timeline, meeting David's eyes. I'm realizing that I don't have a model for what healthy fatherhood looks like. Thomas provided for me, secured my future, but he didn't teach me how to be human. And you were present but hidden, caring but distant. Neither of you showed me how to build real intimacy, how to be vulnerable, how to ask for help without seeing it as weakness. The critique was delivered without malice, just observation, but David felt its sting nonetheless. You're right, he said quietly. I failed you in that regard. I chose invisibility over engagement, convinced myself that watching was enough. It wasn't. Marcus shook his head. I'm not blaming you. I'm trying to understand the pattern so I can break it, because I'm realizing that the way I've lived, driven, isolated, measuring worth by achievement, it's hollow. Firing you was a wake-up call, but it's bigger than that incident. I don't have real relationships. I have professional networks, strategic alliances, but not friendships, not intimacy. I'm 35 years old, and I've never let anyone close enough to actually know me. And I think that comes from being raised by people who, for different reasons, couldn't model vulnerability. He paused, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup as if drawing warmth from it. I want to learn how to be different, and I think maybe you can help me with that. Not by being a traditional father, we're past that, but by being honest, by showing me what authentic connection looks like, even if we have to figure it out together. The request moved David deeply. Marcus was asking him to co-create a relationship neither of them had a blueprint for, to build something new from the fragments of their fractured history. I can try, David said, echoing his earlier promise. But you should know that I'm not good at intimacy either. 35 years of solitude have made me cautious. I don't know how to be close to people, but I want to learn too, for you and maybe for myself. He reached across the table, a gesture that felt bold and terrifying, and Marcus took his hand. The contact was brief, awkward, both of them unused to physical affection, but it was real. It was a beginning. They talked for 2 hours that morning, the conversation meandering through topics both profound and mundane. David's favorite books, Marcus's struggles with insomnia, shared preferences for jazz music and distaste for sweet foods, the small concordances that suggested genetic inheritance manifested in unexpected ways. When they finally parted, standing on the sidewalk outside the cafe, with the city's noise swirling around them, Marcus said something that would stay with David for months afterward. I don't know if I can ever call you Dad. That word belongs to Thomas for better or worse, but I want you in my life. I want to build something with you that's ours, that doesn't try to replicate what I had with my adoptive parents. Is that okay? David felt tears threatening, the emotion rising from somewhere deep and unguarded. That's more than okay, he managed to say. That's everything. Marcus smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his face from the severe CEO mask into something younger, more open. Good, he said simply, and then he was walking away, disappearing into the crowd. But David didn't feel the old panic of separation, because this time he knew Marcus would return. They had made a commitment to presence, to the difficult work of connection, and that commitment was more solid than any proximity David had maintained through silence and shadows. He walked home through the city feeling lighter, feeling seen, feeling for the first time in his life like he might actually deserve the title Marcus couldn't yet speak aloud, but was learning to honor through action. 6 months after the revelation, David received an invitation to dinner at Marcus's apartment, a penthouse in Soma with views of the bay and the kind of minimalist luxury David had only seen in magazines. He arrived with a bottle of wine he'd agonized over selecting, worried about choosing something too cheap or too presumptuous, and Marcus answered the door in jeans and a t-shirt, barefoot, looking more relaxed than David had ever seen him. "Come in," Marcus said, taking the wine with appreciation and leading David into a space that was all clean lines and expensive furniture, art on the walls that David couldn't identify but sensed was significant. The apartment felt like Marcus, controlled, aesthetically perfect, slightly intimidating. But there were new elements too, small disruptions of the pristine order. Books stacked on the coffee table instead of shelved, a throw blanket draped casually over the sofa. Photographs in frames on the mantel, including one David recognized with a jolt. The photo of Marcus as an infant that David had carried for 35 years, now enlarged and displayed. "I had it scanned and printed," Marcus said, following David's gaze. "I hope that's okay. I wanted a reminder of where I came from. All of it, not just the sanitized version." David nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. He moved closer to examine the photo, seeing his younger self's face frozen in that moment of holding his newborn son. The expression, a mixture of love and devastation that was almost unbearable to witness. "You were so young," Marcus said softly, standing beside him. "I look at this photo and I think about what you were facing, the impossible choice you had to make, and I understand it better now. I don't know if I could have made the same decision. I don't know if I could have been that selfless." David shook his head. "It wasn't selfless. It was survival. I was terrified of ruining your life." So Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder, the gesture becoming familiar now, natural. "You didn't ruin anything. You gave me a chance. That's what fathers do." They moved to the dining table, where Marcus had prepared a meal that was impressively competent for someone David had assumed lived on takeout and coffee. Over dinner, they talked about Marcus's recent decision to step back from some of his CEO responsibilities, to delegate more, to prioritize what he called human sustainability over relentless growth. "I've been in therapy," Marcus admitted, pouring wine into both their glasses, trying to unpack everything, the adoption, my relationship with Thomas and Eleanor, the way I've structured my life around achievement at the expense of connection. And one thing I've realized is that I've been running from vulnerability my entire life. I thought strength meant never needing anyone, never showing weakness. But that's not strength. That's just fear dressed up in expensive suits." He smiled ruefully. "I'm trying to learn a different way of being. It's difficult. Decades of conditioning don't evaporate because you decide you want to change." David understood that struggle intimately. He had spent the past 6 months in his own process of transformation, learning to accept Marcus's presence in his life without the buffer of invisibility, learning to speak about his feelings instead of swallowing them, learning that he deserved connection even though he had failed in so many ways. "I've been struggling too," David said, "with worthiness mostly. I gave you away, and then I watched you from the shadows for 30 years like some kind of ghost. I don't know how to accept that you want me in your life now, that I haven't permanently disqualified myself from your love." The word love emerged hesitantly, a term so vulnerable it felt dangerous to speak aloud. Marcus reached across the table, his hand covering David's. "You're here now. That's what matters. We can't change the past, but we can decide what the future looks like. And I want a future where you're present, where we're building something real." They talked late into the night, the conversation ranging across territory, both painful and hopeful. Marcus shared his complicated feelings about Thomas and Eleanor, how learning about David had forced him to reassess his relationship with his adoptive parents, to recognize both their genuine love and their limitations. "I confronted Thomas," Marcus said at one point, "told him about you, about the firing, about everything. He was defensive at first, said he'd raised me to make hard decisions, that firing underperforming employees was part of leadership. But when I pressed him, when I asked if he'd fire me if I was underperforming, he couldn't answer. He realized the hypocrisy. We're working on it. He's trying to understand why I need different values than the ones he instilled." David felt a complicated emotion toward Thomas. This man who had raised his son, who had given Marcus everything David couldn't, but who had also shaped Marcus into someone capable of casual cruelty. "I'm grateful to him," David said carefully, "for taking care of you, for giving you opportunities. But I'm glad you're questioning his methods." Marcus nodded. "Eleanor's been more receptive. She's encouraging me to build a relationship with you. She says that love isn't finite, that having you in my life doesn't diminish what I have with them. I'm trying to believe that." David heard the uncertainty in his son's voice, the fear that choosing David meant betraying Thomas and Eleanor, and he wanted to ease that burden. "Your mother, Eleanor, she's right. I'm not trying to replace anyone. I can't. They're your parents in the ways that matter most. I'm trying to be something else, something additional. Not a replacement, but an expansion." The distinction felt important, a way of honoring the complexity without demanding impossible choices. Marcus smiled, relief visible in his features. "That's exactly what I needed to hear." As the evening drew toward midnight, Marcus showed David the guest room he'd prepared, a space that Marcus said was yours whenever you want it. The room was simple but comfortable, nothing ostentatious, just clean sheets and a window that looked out over the city's lights. "I know you have your apartment," Marcus said, lingering in the doorway, "but I want you to know you have a place here too, that you're welcome, that you belong." David felt overwhelmed by the gesture, by the concrete manifestation of Marcus's commitment to their relationship. "Thank you," he said, the words insufficient but sincere. Marcus hesitated, then stepped forward and embraced David. A full hug that lasted several seconds, their bodies fitting together in a way that felt both awkward and exactly right. When they separated, both had tears in their eyes, neither trying to hide them. Alone in the guest room, David lay in the bed and stared at the ceiling, processing the evening, the past 6 months, the entire arc of his relationship with Marcus, from birth to abandonment, to hidden observation, to revelation, to this fragile, growing connection. He thought about the janitor he had been, the invisible man who moved through the law firm's corridors, believing that proximity without acknowledgement was enough. He thought about Marcus firing him, the casual dismissal that had shattered the architecture David had built his life around, and he thought about the words that had emerged from his mouth in that moment of desperation. "You can't fire your own father, son." Those words had destroyed one life and created the possibility of another. They had forced both David and Marcus into a confrontation with truth that neither had been prepared for, but both had needed. Now, lying in his son's guest room, David understood that fatherhood wasn't defined by biology, or by presence, or by provision, but by the willingness to be known and the courage to keep showing up even when every instinct screamed, to retreat into invisibility. The city glowed beyond the window, millions of lives unfolding in their own complicated patterns of connection and loss, and David felt himself part of that vast human network in a way he never had before. He had a son. Marcus had a father. The relationship was new, uncertain, fragile as early morning fog, but it was real. It was chosen. And unlike the silent watching that had defined David's previous 3 decades, this relationship required him to be present, to speak, to risk rejection and misunderstanding, and all the vulnerabilities that come with genuine intimacy. It was terrifying. It was also the most alive David had felt in his entire life. Tomorrow, he would wake in this guest room and have breakfast with Marcus and then return to his apartment and his job at the supermarket and the modest structures of his daily existence. But he would return knowing he had a place to come back to, a son who wanted him present, a future that wasn't just survival but possibility. The title Marcus couldn't yet speak, Dad, might never be spoken, and that was okay, because what they were building together was bigger than titles, more substantial than words. It was the slow, patient work of 2 damaged people learning to trust each other, to build connection from the ruins of abandonment and silence. And that work, David understood as sleep finally pulled him under, was the truest form of fatherhood he would ever know.